You can't keep pretending she'll just start talking.
Someone snapped, voice sharp with impatience. She's broken, and we don't have time for this. They froze when the mute girl collapsed into silence again, right in the school hallway. Experts blamed trauma. Administrators blamed budget limits, and the powerful board chair watched without stepping in. But the night janitor didn't panic. He knelt calmly, doing something no one else dared try. What happened next would shatter reputations and expose a truth nobody saw coming. This story isn't about silence, it's about who truly knows how to listen. Before I show you the exact moment when the girl whispered her first word and her mother broke down watching, by the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. The floor was cold beneath his knees, the kind of institutional tile that never warmed no matter how long you stood on it. He felt it through the thin fabric of his work pants, but his hands were steady. Too steady for someone everyone else had already dismissed as background noise. While voices stacked on top of each other, protocols, assessments, liability, he stayed quiet, eyes level with the girl's shoes. He didn't rush, didn't flinch, didn't look up for permission. That alone unsettled them. People expected janitors to apologize for existing, to scurry when tension rose. He did neither. His presence had weight like a door held open without asking. The girl's breathing was shallow, almost soundless. Her fingers twisted into the hem of her sweater. He noticed the detail immediately. Most adults didn't. They were too busy looking at charts instead of children. He remembered another hallway, another silence that came after shouting. The memory tightened his chest, but he let it pass without showing it. Control mattered. Calm mattered more. Across the corridor, the woman with the tailored coat stood perfectly still. Dr. Valeria Solis didn't need to raise her voice to dominate a room. Her stillness did that for her. Board chair, policy architect, a woman accustomed to outcomes, not waiting. Her eyes were fixed on her daughter, but something in her expression suggested distance rather than concern, as if the child were a problem set refusing to resolve. Someone whispered that they should call it. Another muttered about specialists already on payroll. No one asked the man on the floor what he was doing. They barely registered him at all. His name was Elias Moreno, and invisibility had become a kind of armor. He reached slowly into the pocket of his janitor's jacket and pulled out a small, battered object. Not a tool, not a phone. Something softer, worn thin by years of handling. He didn't present it like a solution. He simply placed it between them, letting it exist. The girl's eyes flickered. Just once. That was enough. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and old books, a mix unique to public schools, built to last forever and funded like they wouldn't. Overhead, fluorescent lights hummed, indifferent. Somewhere down the corridor, a bell rang too early, then cut off abruptly. Chaos hovered, ready to rush back in. Elias stayed where he was. He spoke quietly, not to the room, but to the space the girl occupied. His voice didn't push. It waited. That alone felt like defiance. Valeria noticed then. Not fully, but enough. Her gaze shifted, irritation flashing across her face as she registered who had inserted himself into a moment she considered hers to manage. Her jaw tightened. This wasn't his place. Labor belonged in the background, not at the center of emotional failures she couldn't solve with resources. Lena stood at the far end of the hall, backpack clutched to her chest. She knew better than to interrupt. She also knew her father's silences meant something important was happening. Children always knew. That was the part adults forgot. A counselor cleared her throat. "Sir, we'll take it from here." He didn't argue. He didn't move either. The contradiction confused them. The girl's shoulders shook once, then stilled. Her fingers loosened. The battered object between them, small, unassuming, caught the light. For the first time since she'd arrived at the school, Mireia Solis leaned forward. Not much, just enough to signal she was still there. Elias exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and adjusted his posture so he was no longer looming. No longer an adult demanding response, just a presence offering safety. He'd learned that long before mops and hall passes entered his life. Back when his title carried weight people respected. Back when loss taught him what mattered more than recognition. Valeria felt something shift, sharp and unwelcome. Control slipping always felt like threat. She folded her arms tighter, as if posture could reassert order. Around her, the hallway had gone quiet. Even the experts had paused, unsure why. The janitor hadn't fixed anything yet. He hadn't solved the crisis. But the silence had changed. The silence didn't snap back the way it usually did when adults lost patience. It stretched, thin but deliberate, like something being tested instead of broken. The counselor lowered her clipboard a fraction. Someone near the lockers shifted their weight. No one spoke. Elias stayed on the floor another second longer than necessary, then slowly rose, careful not to tower over the girl. He stepped back, giving her space without retreating completely. That balance mattered. He'd learned it the hard way, through mistakes that cost more than any career ever had. Mireia's eyes followed him. Not his face, his hands. They were rough, scarred in places that cleaning chemicals didn't explain. He noticed her noticing and resisted the urge to adjust, to soften himself for comfort. Children sensed falseness faster than adults ever did. "Sir," the counselor tried again, quieter now. "We've got protocols." "I know," he said gently, cutting her off without raising his voice. "I'll step away." And he did. No argument, no ego. He moved to the wall beside the drinking fountain, close enough to remain present, far enough to honor boundaries. The crisis hadn't ended, but it had shifted. That was the part most people missed. Valeria watched the exchange with a frown that had nothing to do with concern. This wasn't how interventions worked. There were hierarchies, chains of command, credentials. She glanced at her watch, irritation ticking beneath her composed exterior. Time was a resource, and she hated inefficiency more than failure. Mireia sank onto the floor, back against the lockers. Her breathing steadied. That alone should have been impossible, given the last 10 minutes. The counselor noticed, eyes narrowing slightly, recalibrating. "Maybe we should give her a moment," she murmured, unsure why she'd said it. A moment stretched into 2, then 3. Lena edged closer, stopping where the hallway light dipped just enough to soften shadows. She didn't look at the adults. She looked at Mireia, then at her father. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Permission, not instruction. She sat down cross-legged on the opposite side of the hall, pulled a pencil from her bag, and began sketching on the back of an old worksheet. Nothing fancy, just shapes. Houses with crooked roofs. A sun too big for the page. The scrape of graphite was quiet, rhythmic. Another sound added to the space without demanding attention. Elias felt something loosen in his chest. He hadn't planned that part, he never needed to. Mireia turned her head, just a few degrees. Enough. Valeria stiffened. "Who's that?" she asked sharply. "My daughter?" Elias replied. "That's not appropriate." "She's waiting for me," he said evenly, not defensive, just factual. The board chair hesitated, clearly unused to statements that didn't bend. "This is a sensitive situation." "She knows," he said. Lena didn't look up. She kept drawing, unbothered by authority or observation. Children lived in the present unless taught otherwise. A teacher whispered something behind Valeria's shoulder. She waved it off, eyes fixed on the janitor with growing irritation. There was something about his calm that felt insubordinate, not loud enough to discipline, not humble enough to dismiss. Minutes passed. The bell rang again, this time signaling the end of a period. Students flowed around the scene in careful arcs, curiosity contained by the weight of adult tension. Whispers followed them. Phones came out, then slid back into pockets when administrators glared. Elias noticed the shift before anyone else did. Mireya's shoulders dropped. Her hands unclenched. She reached toward the small object he'd placed on the floor earlier, touching it with the tip of one finger as if testing heat. The counselor inhaled sharply. "She's engaging." Valeria took a step forward, hope flashing across her face before she could stop it. "Mireya." The girl flinched, the moment wavered. Elias lifted a hand slightly, not a stop. A pause. Valeria froze, shock written plainly now. No one paused her, ever. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "Let her lead." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Mireya withdrew her hand, then reached again. This time she picked up the object fully. Her grip tightened. Her breathing hitched, then smoothed. She didn't speak, but she stayed. Something unspoken rippled through the hallway. Recognition, maybe, or doubt cracking. If you're still with me right now, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next changes everything about how this ends. Valeria swallowed, her composure slipping just enough to reveal fear underneath. Not fear for her daughter's safety, fear of not understanding her, of being locked out of something money and power couldn't access. Elias leaned back against the wall, heart pounding despite his calm exterior. He knew this was only the beginning. The fragile calm could still shatter. But for the first time since Mireya arrived at the school, silence wasn't empty. It was listening. The calm didn't last. It rarely did in buildings designed to manage people, not feelings. Administrators began reclaiming space inch by inch, guiding students along, reopening doors, restoring routine like furniture after a storm. The girl remained seated, object clutched, while eyes kept returning to the man by the wall, as if he were a loose wire nobody wanted to touch. Valeria broke first. She stepped forward again, heels clicking too loudly, authority trying to outrun uncertainty. "This has gone on long enough," she said, measured and sharp. "We're disrupting the school." Her gaze flicked to the counselor. "I want a formal plan, now." The counselor nodded automatically, then hesitated, eyes sliding back to Mireya. The hesitation said more than words. It irritated Valeria instantly. Control depended on obedience, and cracks made her uneasy. The man straightened, not defensively, simply aligning himself with the moment. "A plan doesn't have to be loud," he said, "or fast." He kept his voice low, almost private, which made it worse. Public defiance could be punished. Quiet contradiction lingered. Valeria's lips pressed thin. "And you would know?" The implication hung there, heavy with class and contempt. He met her gaze for the first time. Not challenging, assessing. "I would," he said. Around them, staff exchanged looks. Someone coughed. The hallway felt smaller, air thick with anticipation and the faint scent of pencil shavings and cleaner. Mireya shifted. The object slipped from her hands and rolled a few inches. She froze. Everyone did. The counselor lunged instinctively, then stopped herself, palms hovering uselessly. The man moved, slow and deliberate. He didn't grab the object. He stopped short, letting the girl decide. His restraint was the loudest thing in the room. Valeria watched closely now. She couldn't help it. Every executive instinct screamed to intervene, to optimize, to fix. Doing nothing felt like negligence. Yet something undeniable was happening without her permission. Lena scooted closer, careful not to cross an invisible line. She turned her paper, showing the crooked sun to no one in particular, then added another house beside it. 2 houses, uneven but standing. Mireya's eyes filled, not with panic, with recognition. Valeria inhaled sharply, a sound that surprised even her. Memory surfaced uninvited. Late nights, conference calls, a child asleep on a couch she barely remembered tucking in. She shook it off, posture stiffening. Sentiment was dangerous. "This is inappropriate," she said again, softer but colder. "We'll continue this in my office." The word "my" landed like a claim. The man didn't move. "If you move her now, you'll lose her," he said. "No accusation, just consequence." The counselor swallowed. "She's right," she said, then flushed. "I mean, he might be." Valeria stared at her, disbelief flashing. Loyalty was transactional, she made a mental note. Mireya bent forward, retrieved the object herself, and held it to her chest. A tiny sound escaped her throat, not a word, barely even a voice, but enough to snap every head toward her. The hallway held its breath. Valeria's heart hammered. This wasn't the breakthrough she'd envisioned. There were no metrics for this, no reportable outcome, just a fragile moment balanced on restraint. The man felt it too. He knew the edge intimately. He'd walked it with other children, in other buildings, before life had narrowed his world to night shifts and lunchboxes. He resisted the urge to explain, to justify. Explanation would kill it. 5 minutes, he said quietly, not to Valeria, but to the room. Then we reassess. No one argued. Authority had shifted without ceremony. Valeria's hands curled into fists at her sides. She'd built systems that moved governments, yet here she was, stalled by a janitor and a child who wouldn't speak. Anger flared, then something else beneath it, fear of being unnecessary. Mireya stayed seated. The object warmed in her hands. The world, for once, waited. Outside the windows, clouds pressed low, muting the afternoon light, turning glass into dull mirrors. The school felt suspended between bells, between authority and patience, between old habits and something risky. He stayed still, breathing measured, listening for the smallest cue. Valeria remained rigid, pride wrestling fear, while staff hovered, uncertain whose lead to follow. Somewhere, a cart rattled, a door slammed, life insisting on movement. None of it reached the circle around the girl. For 5 minutes, hierarchy loosened. For 5 minutes, a janitor, a child, and a powerful woman shared the same fragile ground, and no one could predict who would step wrong first. The countdown felt louder than any bell, and every adult sensed the moment would define them long after the hallway emptied. Nothing about power prepared Valeria for waiting, and nothing about silence had ever felt this exposed. It unsettled her more than any public failure ever had before today. The 5 minutes stretched thinner, each second pulling at nerves already frayed. No one spoke. Even the building seemed to cooperate, the usual groans and clanks of old pipes settling into an unnatural stillness. He felt the tension in his shoulders but kept his breathing slow, steady, the way he'd learned back when silence could mean danger instead of discomfort. Mireya rocked slightly, the motion almost imperceptible. Her thumb rubbed the edge of the object over and over, like she was memorizing its shape. He recognized the behavior immediately, self-regulation, anchoring. The fact that she'd found it on her own mattered more than any progress report ever would. Valeria stood rigid, arms crossed, gaze fixed on her daughter. From the outside, she looked composed. Inside, irritation and fear tangled together, tightening her chest. She'd authorized entire programs with less uncertainty than she felt standing in that hallway. This wasn't how solutions worked. There were steps, timelines, authority. The counselor glanced at her watch, then at him. "We're almost out of time," she whispered. He nodded once, acknowledging the reality without surrendering to it. "Then, we don't rush the ending," he murmured back. That unsettled her more than defiance would have. Endings were supposed to be decisive. A faint sound escaped Mireya's throat again, slightly clearer this time. Not a word, a breath shaped by intention. He didn't react outwardly. Inside, his pulse spiked. Too much attention now could shatter everything. Lena shifted her drawing closer, still not looking directly. She added a third house, smaller than the others, tucked between them. Her pencil paused, then shaded a door. Open. Valeria noticed the drawing before she meant to. Something about the simplicity irritated her, then disarmed her. 3 houses, no labels, no hierarchy. Her jaw tightened as a strange ache pressed behind her eyes. She pushed it down, focusing back on Mireya. "Sweetheart," she said, unable to stop herself. Her voice softened despite her intentions. "Mom's here." The girl stiffened. The object slipped from her hands again, clattering softly against the tile. The sound echoed too loud in the silence. He moved instantly, not toward the object, but toward Valeria. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. "Please," he said quietly, "not yet." The word "please" landed wrong. It wasn't deferential, it was protective. Valeria bristled, then faltered. She looked at her daughter, really looked, and saw the difference, the tension, the fear returning. Her hands trembled slightly before she clasped them together. She took a step back, heels scraping. It felt like retreat. It felt like failure. She hated both. Mireya's breathing steadied again, though tears pooled in her eyes. She leaned forward, picked up the object once more, and pressed it to her lips. A sound formed, fragile and raw, then dissolved into a sob. The counselor covered her mouth, eyes wide. "Oh my God," she whispered. He stayed where he was, every instinct screaming to guide, to help, to translate. He resisted. This wasn't his moment to lead, it was the girl's. Valeria's composure cracked. A single tear escaped before she could stop it, sliding down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She couldn't move. Watching from a distance suddenly felt unbearable. The hallway felt charged now, the silence alive instead of empty. Staff leaned in unconsciously, drawn by something none of them had been trained to witness. Progress without permission. Mireya lowered the object slowly. Her lips trembled. She looked up, not at her mother but at him, seeking confirmation, safety. He gave a small nod, not encouragement, acceptance. Her mouth opened, a breath, another. The sound that followed wasn't clear enough to be language, but it was intentional. A shape of a word, hovering on the edge of being. Valeria's breath hitched. Her knees weakened, forcing her to grip the back of a nearby chair. All the meetings, all the strategies, all the distance she'd justified as necessary suddenly felt absurdly small. The bell rang again, signaling the end of the 5 minutes. No one moved, no one acknowledged it. Time, for once, had lost authority. The counselor lowered her clipboard completely. "We should document this," she said faintly, then shook her head as if the words tasted wrong. He exhaled slowly, feeling the tremor in his hands now that the moment was cresting. This was the edge, the dangerous part, where adults rushed in and ruined things. Valeria straightened, wiping her face with the heel of her palm. When she spoke again, her voice was unsteady, stripped of polish. What? What do we do next? The question stunned the room. She wasn't issuing instructions. She was asking. He met her eyes, seeing not power now, but fear and love colliding without a map. "We follow her," he said simply. Mireia clutched the object tighter, shoulders shaking, lips moving silently as if practicing. The hallway held its breath again, not in tension this time, but in hope. The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected. What do we do next wasn't something Valeria Solis ever asked without already knowing the answer. Yet there she stood, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on her daughter like the ground beneath her authority had shifted. No one rushed to fill the silence. The counselor glanced between them, uncertain. Administrators hovered at a distance, suddenly aware that stepping in might be the wrong move for once. He spoke carefully. "We don't change rooms. We don't bring in new faces. We don't turn this into a performance." His tone stayed even, but every word carried weight. "We let her finish what she started." Valeria nodded once, stiffly. Agreement didn't come naturally to her in moments she didn't control. Still, she stayed where she was, hands clasped tight, resisting every urge to fix. Mireia's breathing hitched again, then slowed. Tears slid freely now, unchecked, but her grip on the object didn't loosen. She pressed it against her chin, eyes squeezing shut as if the world were too loud even in silence. The man shifted his stance, grounding himself. He felt the old instincts rise, the ones shaped by classrooms instead of hallways, by children who learned trust through patience instead of pressure. He'd buried that part of himself for years, telling himself it belonged to a past life he no longer lived. Yet, here it was, answering a call he hadn't realized he'd been waiting for. Lena watched quietly, her drawing forgotten in her lap. She understood enough to know this wasn't about her anymore. Still, she stayed close, presence steady, a reminder that children didn't need to be fixed to be valuable. A soft sound broke through the stillness. Not a cry this time, something shaped, fragile. The counselor's breath caught audibly. Valeria took an involuntary step forward, then stopped herself. Her hands trembled again. She clenched them harder, nails biting into skin. Waiting felt like punishment. Mireia's lips moved, once, twice. The sound faltered, then vanished. Frustration flashed across her face, sharp and sudden. He felt it then, the risk point. This was where most adults pushed too hard, turning effort into failure. He lowered himself back to the floor, slow and deliberate, returning to her level. Not touching, not instructing, just there. "It's okay," he said quietly. 2 words, no demand hidden inside them. The girl's shoulders sagged. Relief washed through her expression, followed by something like determination. She inhaled deeply, chest rising, then falling. A sound emerged again, clearer. Still not a word, but closer than before. The hallway seemed to lean in. Valeria covered her mouth, tears spilling freely now. She didn't bother hiding them. Years of discipline dissolved under the weight of the moment. This wasn't something she could schedule or spin. This was raw and terrifying and beautiful all at once. "If you're feeling this tension right now," he said softly, almost to the air itself, "make sure you're subscribed, because what comes next is the moment everything changes." The words slipped out naturally, a pause before something irreversible. Mireia opened her eyes. She looked at the object, then at him, then, finally, at her mother. The glance was brief, uncertain, but real. Valeria sobbed once, sharp and unrestrained, then stilled herself again, nodding through tears, as if to say, "I see you." The girl's lips parted. Her throat worked. Sound gathered, fragile but intentional. The letter barely existed, more breath than voice. The counselor sank onto a nearby chair, stunned. Administrators forgot to be invisible. Even the building seemed to hold its breath. Valeria's knees buckled. She caught herself on the wall, eyes never leaving her daughter. Every achievement she'd ever chased paled in comparison to that single sound. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He knew better. Victory here wasn't loud, it was earned and restrained. Mireia swallowed and tried again. The sound came out clearer this time, followed by another. 2 syllables brushing against meaning. The moment teetered on the edge, fragile as glass. He stayed still, heart pounding, trusting her to finish the step herself. Her voice trembled, then steadied just enough. Ma. The word didn't fully land, but it existed, undeniable, alive. Valeria collapsed to her, knees, hands shaking, breath breaking free of control. She didn't care who saw. Power had never prepared her for this kind of surrender. Mireia clutched the object tighter, eyes wide, as if surprised by herself. Silence returned, but it was different now. Changed. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself again. This wasn't the end. It was the door opening, and everyone in that hallway knew they'd just witnessed something money, titles, and authority could never force into existence. The sound lingered long after it faded, hanging in the hallway like a vibration no one could shake. No one spoke. Even Mireia seemed stunned by what she'd done, her mouth slightly open, breath uneven, eyes darting as if afraid the moment might be taken back. Valeria stayed on her knees. She hadn't meant to fall that far, hadn't planned on surrendering her balance in front of staff and strangers, but her body had decided before her mind could interfere. Tears blurred everything, yet she didn't look away. She couldn't. The fear now wasn't that her daughter wouldn't speak again. It was that she'd never listened well enough to deserve it. The man remained still, though every instinct urged him to anchor the moment, to gently guide it forward. He forced himself to wait. Pushing now would turn progress into pressure. He'd seen that mistake too many times, made it once himself, and carried the weight ever since. Mireia's fingers loosened around the object. It slipped slightly, then steadied. She drew a shaky breath, chest fluttering like a bird testing wings. Her eyes flicked to her mother again, lingering half a second longer than before. Valeria wiped her face quickly, embarrassed by her own rawness. She wanted to speak, to respond, to fill the silence with reassurance. She remembered the man's words, let her lead, and bit them back, nodding instead. A small nod, unsure, honest. The counselor exhaled slowly, as if she'd been holding her breath for years, rather than minutes. "This is significant," she whispered, then shook her head. "I don't even know how to record this." "You don't," he said quietly. "You remember it." The counselor looked at him, really looked, and something shifted behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or respect. She closed her clipboard and rested it against her leg, forgotten. Mireia shifted her weight, pushing herself upright. It took effort. The hallway suddenly felt too big, too full of eyes. Her breathing quickened again, panic threatening to reclaim ground. He moved, not closer, not away, just enough to be seen in her peripheral vision. A steady presence, like a lighthouse that didn't demand attention but existed all the same. "It's okay to stop," he said softly. "You did enough." Her shoulders sagged with relief. The pressure eased. She nodded once, A sharp, decisive movement, then sat back down, curling inward protectively. The object returned to her chest, a shield and a reminder. Valeria pushed herself back to her feet, legs unsteady. She smoothed her coat automatically, a reflex she'd honed over decades. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, stripped of command. "Thank you," she said. And for the first time, the words weren't performative. He inclined his head slightly, not acknowledgement. Acceptance. Administrators began murmuring again, unsure how to reassert order after witnessing something so unscripted. Someone mentioned liability. Another suggested a private room. Their words bounced off the moment, hollow and late. Valeria turned to them sharply. "No," she said, finding steel again, though it rang differently now. "We're done for today." They blinked, surprised, but complied. Power, when it returned, came quieter. The hallway slowly emptied, footsteps echoing as staff redirected students and closed doors. The building exhaled, routine creeping back in around the edges. Lena stood and walked over, careful not to intrude. She knelt near Mireya, holding up her drawing without a word. 3 houses, 1 small, 1 open door. Mireya studied it intently. Her finger traced the outline of the door, then paused. She looked up at Lena, eyes questioning. Lena smiled, small and patient, and nodded. A tiny sound escaped Mireya's throat again. Not a word, but intentional, practiced. She didn't look afraid this time. Valeria watched the exchange, chest aching. She'd spent years believing provision was love, that distance was sacrifice. Watching her daughter respond to quiet patience shattered that illusion more effectively than any accusation ever could. She turned to the man. "You didn't answer me earlier," she said carefully. "How you know?" He hesitated, the past pressing close. "It's not important right now," he said. She studied him, then nodded. For once, she accepted what she wasn't given. The counselor approached slowly. "We'll need to adjust her plan," she said. "Everything about it." "Yes," Valeria replied without hesitation. "We will." Mireya leaned back against the lockers, exhaustion settling in now that the adrenaline faded. Her eyes fluttered, heavy but peaceful. She'd crossed a threshold. The cost showed in her posture. He recognized the signs immediately. "She needs rest," he said gently. Valeria nodded again. "We'll go home." She crouched in front of her daughter, careful, deliberate. She didn't touch her. She waited. Mireya looked at her for a long moment, then leaned forward and rested her forehead briefly against Valeria's shoulder. The contact was brief, tentative, but real. Valeria closed her eyes, breath shuddering. She didn't move. She didn't try to hold tighter. He watched quietly, heart heavy and light all at once. This was the real work. Not the breakthrough, but what followed. As they prepared to leave, Valeria paused beside him. "I owe you more than thanks," she said quietly. He shook his head. "She did the work." Valeria nodded, absorbing that truth. As they walked away, the object still clutched in Mireya's hands, the hallway returned to itself. Ordinary again, but something fundamental had shifted, and none of them could pretend otherwise. The hallway emptied slowly, as if the building itself needed time to recover from what had happened. Lockers stood closed, lights hummed back into notice, and the familiar smells of cleaner and paper returned to dominance. Ordinary reclaimed the space, but the people who'd stood there didn't return to their routines unchanged. Valeria walked beside her daughter, steps careful, measured to match Mireya's pace. She resisted the urge to guide her with a hand on her back, even when instinct screamed to do so. Each step felt like learning a new language with no grammar rules yet. Mireya leaned heavily against her, exhaustion pulling at her limbs now that the effort had passed. Her eyes stayed open, alert but calm, scanning the world, with a quiet intensity that hadn't been there before. She clutched the object loosely now, not as a lifeline, but as something familiar she didn't want to lose. They stopped near the front doors. Afternoon light filtered through the glass, pale and diffused, catching dust in the air. For a moment, none of them spoke. The man remained a few steps back, hands clasped loosely in front of him. He'd learned long ago when to step forward and when to stay out of the way. This was the latter. Valeria turned to face him fully. Without the hallway full of witnesses, she looked smaller somehow, not weaker, human. "I meant what I said," she began, then paused, recalibrating. "This doesn't disappear after today." "No," he agreed. "It shouldn't." She nodded, lips pressing together. "I want to make sure she gets what she needs, not just here, everywhere." Her voice wavered, then steadied. "I don't want this undone by good intentions and bad timing." He studied her for a moment, weighing honesty against caution. "Then you'll need to slow down," he said, "and listen more than you plan." The advice wasn't framed as instruction, yet it landed like one. Valeria didn't bristle. She absorbed it, eyes lowering briefly before lifting again. "I don't know how," she admitted. The admission surprised her as much as anyone. She'd built her career on knowing how. The absence felt like standing on open ground with no map. "You'll learn," he said, "if you let her teach you." Mireya shifted slightly, head tilting as if she sensed the conversation centered around her. Her gaze flicked between them, assessing. She didn't speak, but she stayed present. Lena hovered nearby, backpack slung over one shoulder, watching with the quiet curiosity of a child who sensed significance without needing explanation. When Mireya noticed her again, she hesitated, then lifted the object a few inches, as if showing it. Lena smiled. "You kept? It's safe," she said simply. Mireya nodded, a clear, deliberate nod. Valeria's breath caught at the smallness of it. The front doors opened and closed as staff filtered out, offering cautious glances. Word was already spreading. Not details, impressions. Something unusual. Something that didn't fit neatly into reports or meetings. Valeria straightened as a pair of administrators approached, ready to assert presence. "We're done for the day," she said firmly, before they could speak. "Cancel the follow-up meetings. I'll handle the rest." They hesitated, then nodded, retreating. Power still worked. It just felt different now, less absolute, more earned. Outside, the air was cool, tinged with the scent of rain that hadn't arrived yet. Mireya blinked against the change in light, then leaned closer to her mother. Valeria adjusted instinctively, aligning herself without crowding. The movement was awkward, but intentional. He watched them go, a familiar ache settling in his chest. Moments like this always carried two weights, relief and reckoning. He'd helped open a door. What came next would be harder. Valeria paused at the edge of the walkway and turned back. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "same time." She nodded, then hesitated. "I'd like to talk about her and about you." He met her gaze. "We can talk about her," he said. Valeria understood the boundary. She accepted it. "Tomorrow," she repeated, then turned and guided her daughter toward the waiting car. Mireya glanced back once. Her eyes met his, steady and unafraid. Her lips moved, almost imperceptibly, as if shaping something she wasn't ready to release yet. Then she was gone. The doors closed. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Lena exhaled loudly, the tension finally reaching her now that it was safe to do so. "That was a lot," she said. He nodded, resting a hand briefly on her shoulder. "Yeah, it was." They stood there a moment longer, letting the building settle around them. Somewhere inside, a janitor's cart rattled. A bell chimed faintly. Life resumed, but the air felt different. Charged. As if the school itself had noticed that something it had never been designed to hold had passed through its halls. He gathered his things, slipping the routine back on like a familiar coat. Mops and keys, schedules and silence. Yet beneath it, something stirred. A past he'd kept buried for survival beginning to press forward again. Tomorrow wouldn't be simple. Valeria's world didn't bend easily, and institutions resisted change even when confronted with undeniable proof. But a door had opened, and once a child found her voice, no amount of authority could truly silence what followed. The next morning arrived without ceremony, gray light sliding through high windows as keys clinked and doors unlocked. He moved through the building the same way he always did, cart rolling softly, shoes echoing against tile. Nothing about his posture suggested yesterday had cracked something open, yet every step felt heavier, as if the floor remembered. He paused near the hallway where it happened, fingers tightening briefly around the handle. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and rain-soaked coats. Somewhere, a vent rattled. Routine reclaimed the space, but beneath it, anticipation hummed like electricity trapped behind walls. Valeria arrived early, earlier than staff expected. No entourage, no phone pressed to her ear. Her coat was the same, but the way she wore it wasn't. She stood near the office doors, watching students arrive, eyes tracking movement with unfamiliar softness. When she saw him, her spine straightened, reflexive authority rising before settling again. "You're here," she said, unnecessary but honest. He nodded. "Same time," he replied. The exchange was brief, but it carried weight. Neither pretended yesterday hadn't happened, they simply didn't name it yet. They walked together, not side by side but not apart either, toward an empty classroom borrowed for the morning. Desks lined the walls, pushed back to make space. Sunlight pooled on the floor, catching dust motes mid-air. Valeria hesitated at the doorway, hand hovering near the frame. "I canceled the specialists," she said quietly, "just for today." He studied her face, searching for resistance, found only effort. "That helps," he said. She exhaled, relief flickering before control returned. Learning to listen looked like this, he realized. Uncomfortable pauses, choices without guarantees. Maria arrived moments later, guided by her mother but not steered. Her steps were slow, cautious, eyes scanning the room. When she saw him, her shoulders loosened a fraction. She held the object loosely now, no longer clenched. He stayed back, letting her enter first. The classroom sounded different with her in it. Breathing louder, silence fuller. She sat near the window, light warming her hands. Valeria hovered, then caught herself, choosing a chair several feet away. Distance intentional. The girl glanced at her, surprised, then settled. The morning unfolded without structure. No clipboards, no timers. He demonstrated nothing, explained nothing. Instead, he adjusted small things, curtains, chair angles, noise levels, crafting an environment that asked nothing. Maria explored cautiously, touching surfaces, tracing lines in dust. Once she made a soft sound, barely audible. Valeria stiffened, then relaxed when he didn't react. Trust built in restraint. If you're feeling the tension of this waiting, make sure you're subscribed, because what's being built here will soon collide with a world that doesn't know how to slow down. Valeria watched, hands folded tightly in her lap. Every instinct urged her to intervene, to optimize progress, to mark improvement. She fought it minute by minute. The fight showed in her jaw, the way she counted breaths under her coat. When Mireya glanced back at her again, longer this time, Valeria didn't speak. She simply nodded, eyes shining. The girl turned forward, lips moving silently, practicing. Something like a smile ghosted across her face, tentative but real. He felt a familiar ache, hope balanced on fear of loss. Outside the room, whispers traveled. Staff noticed the closed door, the absence of experts. Curiosity sharpened into suspicion. Institutions didn't like unscheduled successes. He heard fragments as he passed. Questions about authority, appropriateness, liability. Old alarms stirred in his chest. He'd lived this before, back when credentials had made him visible, then dangerous. The difference now was motivation. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about protecting what had begun. He adjusted his grip on the cart handle, grounding himself, preparing for resistance he knew would come. Valeria joined him briefly in the hallway while Mireya rested. "They're asking questions," she said. Not a complaint, a warning. He nodded. "They will." She studied him. "You've done this before." It wasn't a question. He considered deflection, then shook his head. "Not like this." She accepted that, lips pressing together. "I won't let them rush this," she said. The promise surprised them both. Power, offered differently, felt heavier. He met her gaze. "Then we're aligned," he said. By midday, the classroom held a fragile rhythm. Mireya hummed once, then stopped, eyes wide as if she'd startled herself. No one clapped. No one praised. The moment passed safely. Valeria wiped at her eyes, laughing softly through tears she didn't hide. He watched them together, mother and daughter learning each other again, and felt the weight of what he was preparing for. The world would demand explanations soon. Credentials, histories. He wasn't ready to offer them yet. For now, he chose the harder path, holding the line, quietly, until the voice growing in that room could stand against anything waiting outside. By afternoon, the tension had a name, even if no one said it aloud. It lived in sideways glances, in emails drafted and unsent, in the way doors closed more quietly than usual. Success without authorization always made institutions nervous. He felt it in the building's posture, the subtle tightening around him as if walls themselves were bracing. Valeria stood her ground. That alone unsettled people. She canceled meetings, rerouted schedules, and answered questions with deliberate vagueness. It wasn't deception, it was protection. Still, pressure mounted. Authority tolerated deviation only when it could be explained, categorized, controlled. Mireya sensed the shift. Children always did. The classroom felt different now, not unsafe, but charged. She stayed close to the window, fingers tapping lightly against the sill, a rhythm she'd begun to repeat whenever anxiety crept in. He noticed. Immediately, adjusted the room without comment, closing the door more gently, lowering distant noise. A knock interrupted them. Sharp, professional. Valeria stiffened, then exhaled slowly. "Stay," she murmured to her daughter, then stepped outside, closing the door behind her. The hallway swallowed her voice, but not the intent. Two administrators stood waiting. Their expressions were polite, rehearsed, concern masquerading as protocol. He couldn't hear the words, but he recognized the posture. Questions about oversight, about qualifications, about risk. He'd heard them before years ago, when his name still opened doors instead of closing them. Inside, Mireya's tapping quickened. He moved closer, not intruding, simply aligning his presence with her line of sight. She glanced up, eyes wide, then took a breath. The tapping slowed. The door opened again. Valeria returned alone, face composed but pale. "We need to talk," she said quietly. He nodded. "We can step out." Mireya shook her head sharply, surprising them both. Her fingers clenched, then loosened. She made a small sound, frustrated, almost angry. Valeria knelt instinctively, then stopped herself halfway, choosing instead to sit on a chair nearby. "I'm not leaving," she said softly. "I promise." The girl studied her, searching for cracks. Finding none, she settled back, shoulders tense but no longer rigid. Outside the door, footsteps lingered. He felt the clock ticking now, the institutional countdown toward intervention. Preparation mattered. Valeria met his gaze. "They want credentials," she said. "They want to know why a janitor's dictating an intervention plan." He almost smiled. "Almost. And you?" "I want what works," she said without hesitation. "But they won't accept that forever." "No," he agreed. "They'll need context." Silence stretched. He weighed choices he'd avoided for years. Protection through obscurity had kept him safe, kept his daughter's life small and manageable. Exposure would change that. It always did. Mireya made another sound, clearer this time. A frustrated exhale shaped like a syllable. She pressed her palms flat against the desk, grounding herself. Progress. Fragile, but real. He made his decision. "Give me until tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll explain, publicly." Valeria's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "No," he admitted, "but it's time." The door opened before she could respond. The administrators returned, less patient now. "We need to discuss liability," one began. "Yes," Valeria said firmly. "We do. Tomorrow, with everyone present." They hesitated, surprised by her certainty. "And him?" the other asked, nodding toward the classroom. "Yes," she said, "especially him." They left, dissatisfaction trailing behind them like static. Inside, the room exhaled. Mireya slumped slightly, exhaustion creeping back in. He crouched beside her, careful, steady. "You did good," he said quietly. She frowned, then shook her head. The sound that followed wasn't a word, but it was closer than before, intentional, determined. Valeria watched, heart swelling and aching in equal measure. Tomorrow would bring scrutiny, exposure, judgment, but it would also bring truth. He straightened slowly, feeling the weight of what he'd agreed to settle into his bones. The past he'd hidden would step into light again, not as defense but as explanation. Mireya leaned back in her chair, eyes fluttering closed for a brief second before opening again. She wasn't done. Neither was he. Outside, the building hummed with anticipation. Unaware it was about to witness a reversal no amount of authority could undo. Morning arrived heavier than the last, burdened with expectation instead of possibility. The building felt awake before the people inside it. Lights already humming, doors propped open like the school itself was bracing. He felt it the moment. He stepped through the entrance, the subtle shift from quiet tolerance to scrutiny. Today wasn't about patience. It was about answers. The room they'd chosen wasn't accidental. A multi-purpose space near the front office, glass walls on two sides, open enough to discourage secrecy. Chairs were arranged in neat rows. Administrators filled the first line, expressions neutral but alert. Teachers clustered behind them, curiosity sharpening their attention. Valeria stood near the front, composed, hands folded, every inch the executive again. except her eyes, which kept drifting toward the side door. Mireya entered with her, smaller than everyone else in the room, steps hesitant but unafraid. The object was in her hand. Fingers relaxed around it now, not clutched. He followed a few paces back, cart left behind, uniform still on. He felt eyes track him, measure him. Let them, he thought. Running had never saved anyone. They took their places. The room settled, whispers fading. A senior, administrator, cleared his throat. "We're here to understand the deviations from approved protocol," he began, "and to assess—" A sound interrupted him. Soft, uncertain, but unmistakably intentional. Mireya's shoulders trembled as she inhaled. The room stilled instantly, breath held not by instruction, but instinct. She pressed the object against her palm, grounding herself, eyes fixed on the floor. Ma," she said, the sound fragile but real. The word landed like a dropped glass. Not shattering, stunning. Valeria's breath broke free of her chest in a quiet sob she didn't try to hide. Her hand flew to her mouth, then lowered as she caught herself, nodding through tears. She didn't move. She didn't rush. She stayed where she was, honoring the space her daughter had claimed. Mireya swallowed, courage flickering. She lifted her head slightly. "Mom," she whispered. The room erupted, not in noise but reaction. Hands flew to faces. Someone gasped. A teacher sank into a chair. Even the administrator who'd been speaking stood frozen, mouth half open. Authority evaporated by a moment no policy could contain. He felt it then, the culmination. This was the peak. The crisis resolved not by credentials but by trust made visible. Mireya's knees wobbled. He moved instantly, positioning himself close enough to steady her without touching. She leaned back into the chair, exhausted but radiant, breath uneven, eyes bright with shock at her own voice. Valeria dropped to her knees again. No hesitation this time. "I'm here," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." The administrator found his voice at last. "This is extraordinary," he said weakly. "But we still need to address—" "I will," Valeria interrupted, rising slowly, strength settling differently now. "All of it. Right now." She turned, sweeping the room with a gaze that commanded attention not through power, but clarity. "You want to know why this worked?" she said. "Why your experts failed and my daughter found her voice?" Silence answered her. She gestured toward him. "Because he listened, because he didn't demand, because he knew when to wait." Eyes shifted to him again, sharper now, curious instead of dismissive. "He isn't just a janitor," Valeria continued. "And even if he were, it wouldn't matter. But for those who require titles, he was a child development specialist, trauma-informed. He walked away from prestige to raise his daughter when his world collapsed." A murmur rippled through the room. He felt the old weight settle, familiar and unwelcome. Exposure always felt like standing without armor. Still, he didn't interrupt. This wasn't his reveal to control. "I watched him choose restraint over recognition," Valeria said, voice steady. "I watched my daughter respond to that in ways none of us could force, and I won't apologize for protecting it." The administrator swallowed. That information should have been disclosed. "I'm disclosing it now," she replied calmly, "in front of witnesses." Mireya stirred, then spoke again, softer this time but clearer. "Mom, stay." Valeria knelt beside her instantly, eyes shining. "I will." The room exhaled collectively. Whatever arguments had been prepared felt absurd now, paper shields against something undeniably human. He looked down at Mireya, pride and awe tangling in his chest. She'd done this. Not him, not her mother, her. The administrator nodded slowly, defeat mixing with understanding. "We'll revise the plan," he said, immediately. Valeria met his gaze. Good. The crisis had passed, the reversal complete, and in a room designed for authority, it was a child's voice that had rewritten everything. The room didn't empty right away. People lingered, unsure how to return to procedure, after witnessing something that stripped it of relevance. Chairs scraped softly. Someone sniffed. Someone else stared at the floor like it might offer instructions. The glass walls reflected faces that looked subtly altered, as if a line had been crossed and no one was certain which side they now stood on. Valeria remained beside her daughter, one hand hovering near Mireya's shoulder without touching. She'd learned that boundary in the hardest way possible. Her authority hadn't vanished, but it had rearranged itself around something more fragile and more powerful than command. When she finally stood, it wasn't to address the room again. It was to steady herself. Administrators approached in cautious pairs. Their questions came slower now, stripped of edge. Liability turned into logistics. Oversight softened into support. No one challenged the outcome. They couldn't. The evidence still echoed in the air, too alive to argue with. He stayed where he was, hands loose at his sides, feeling the familiar dissonance of being seen again. Recognition brought relief, but also a quiet ache. The life he'd chosen, smaller, quieter, had been deliberate, necessary. Exposure reopened doors he'd sealed for survival. A teacher approached first. "I didn't know," she said, not accusatory, just awed. He nodded. There was nothing to add. Another followed, then another, gratitude replacing curiosity. Each interaction chipped away at the invisible barrier he'd worn like skin. Valeria watched it all with a complicated expression. Guilt threaded through her relief. She'd dismissed him without question, folded him into a category she never examined. Power had blinded her to proximity. She stepped closer, voice low. "You should have told us." He met her gaze, calm but firm. "You wouldn't have listened then." She didn't argue. The truth settled between them. Heavy but clarifying. "I would now," she said. "I know." Mireya shifted, exhaustion overtaking adrenaline. Valeria noticed instantly, scooping her up carefully as if relearning how to hold something precious without squeezing. Mireya leaned into her, cheek pressed against her shoulder, eyes half closed but peaceful. As they prepared to leave, Valeria paused again, turning back toward him. "The board will formalize this," she said. "Your role, your credentials. I can make it right." He shook his head gently. "Not everything needs fixing." She hesitated, then nodded. "Then tell me what you want." The question felt heavier than any offer she could have made. He glanced at his daughter standing near the door, watching quietly. "I want her protected," he said, "from being rushed, from being turned into a case study." "That I can promise," Valeria replied without hesitation. "And I want to stay where I am," he added, "for now." Her brows knit in surprise. "You don't want—" "I want continuity," he said, "for them, for me." She absorbed that, then offered a small, genuine smile. "Then that's what we'll do." They left shortly after, the room emptying behind them. The building returned to its rhythms, but the echo of Mireya's voice lingered in corners no mop could reach. Later, in the quiet of the custodial office, he sat alone for the first time that day. The hum of the vending machine filled the space, familiar and grounding. He rested his forearms on his knees, breathing deeply, letting the weight of the moment settle without rushing to file it away. He thought of the life he'd stepped away from, the lectures, the conferences, the applause that came with solutions delivered on schedule. He didn't miss it, not the way he'd feared he might. What he'd found instead, this quiet, imperfect impact, felt truer. A knock sounded at the door. He looked up as Lena stepped in, backpack slung low. "You okay?" she asked. He smiled softly. "Yeah, just tired." She nodded, understanding more than he'd ever taught her. "She talked," she said, wonder still fresh in her voice. "She did." Lena grinned, then sobered. Does that mean things change now? He considered the question carefully. "Some things," he said, "not the ones that matter." She seemed satisfied with that. She leaned against the doorframe, content to share the quiet. Outside, Valeria sat in her car longer than necessary, Mireya asleep beside her. She watched the school through the windshield, seeing it not as an institution she controlled, but as a place where she'd nearly missed her own child. Tears slid silently, not from pain this time, but resolve. Tomorrow, systems would adjust. Policies would be rewritten. Credit would be assigned. But tonight, a mother had heard her daughter's voice, and a man who'd been invisible by design finally allowed himself to be seen, without losing the life he'd built in the shadows. It felt, at last, like balance. The school settled into evening the way it always did, lights dimming in stages, hallways emptying until footsteps became rare and deliberate. He finished his round slowly, not because the work demanded it, but because the day had. Each room carried echoes now, not sounds, but moments, reminders that something ordinary had held something extraordinary and survived. He paused outside the multi-purpose room, door closed, glass reflecting a version of himself that felt both familiar and newly defined. Not restored, not elevated, just aligned. He turned away without regret and continued down the corridor, keys chiming softly with each step. Outside, dusk pressed low against the windows. The sky held that brief, uncertain color between day and night, neither claiming the other. He liked that hour. It didn't rush you to choose. At home, dinner was simple. Lena talked about her day in bursts, circling back to the same point over and over like she needed to confirm it hadn't vanished. "She really said it," she repeated, wonder still intact. He listened, nodded, smiled when it mattered. He didn't correct her excitement. Some things deserved repetition. Later, after dishes were done and the house quieted, he stood in the doorway of her room, watching sleep claim her gently. Parenthood had taught him that victories rarely announce themselves. They arrived quietly, then asked if you were paying attention. Across town, Valeria sat at the edge of Mireya's bed, lamp low, hand resting just close enough to be felt. The girl slept deeply, the kind of rest that came only after effort. Her lips moved once, unconsciously, shaping something soundless. Valeria's breath caught, then steadied. She stayed. She didn't check her phone. She didn't leave. Tomorrow would bring meetings, headlines, careful language. She'd face them differently now. Not as a woman proving competence, but as a mother protecting something fragile and real. Power would still be hers, but it would answer to listening first. Back at the school, the night crew arrived. Someone asked him, casually, if the rumors were true. He shrugged. "Kids surprise you," he said, and left it there. Not every truth needed expansion. Days passed. The building adjusted. Plans shifted. Mireya returned slowly, supported without spectacle. Her voice came in pieces, soft, deliberate, but it came. When it faltered, no one panicked. They waited. That was the change. He watched from his quiet corner, cart rolling, presence steady. He didn't reclaim his old title. He didn't need to. What he'd built now fit the life he lived. And for the first time in years, the past felt like foundation instead of shadow. One afternoon, Mireya stopped near him in the hallway. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She held up the object, then pointed gently at him, then herself. A bridge. He nodded, throat tight, and let her walk on. That was enough. Stories like this don't end with applause. They end with continuity, with small voices growing stronger because someone chose patience over power, with dignity restored not through recognition, but through restraint. If this story stayed with you, ask me for the next story title you want to hear. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. She let him sit at her table in a busy cafe, not knowing he was a millionaire. Single dad disguised. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next? Because the world changes most when someone finally listens to the people it taught itself to ignore.